Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Cliff Lauson. I'm senior curator at the Hayward Gallery and curator of Matthew Barney Redoubt here at the Hayward. Tonight's event is an in conversation with Matthew Barney. It's a very special event. We're absolutely thrilled that he can dial in, join us from overseas. So Matthew Barney, one of the most there he is, hello. Among the most prominent artists of his generation, I'd say, and forward. His films and related bodies of drawing and sculpture have been exhibited internationally for many, many decades to wide acclaim. Barney's early works, he featured his own body in live performances and video installations that tested the limits of athletic physicality, such as the ongoing series Drawing Restraint. And that started in the late 1980s. Moving on, the Cremaster cycle, so 1994 to 2002, was a series of 5 feature-length films drawing on biology, biography, mythology, to explore the process of artistic creation. And this set of films really cemented Barney's reputation as an artist and filmmaker. And I'm sure many of you in the audience came to know Matthew's work at that moment. In 2010, he embarked on a new body of work, and that included outdoor performances, sculptures made from cast metals, and it culminated and was a part of the River of Fundament in 2014. So that itself was a nearly 6-hour operatic film, and it was created with many collaborators that Barney's had long-standing relationships with, including Jonathan Bepler. And that film actually takes us to the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho, which is the setting of Redoubt, the present body of work and film that is the subject and the main piece of work of the exhibition presently at the Hayward. So Matthew's dialing in, joining us, where he lives and works in New York, and I believe you're in your studio there. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining in. So I thought I'd start generally, and sort of having gone through the biography there. It's a thing when I'm often explaining your work to people and kind of taking a brief trot through your career, if that's possible. But the thing that I think makes those bodies of work unique is that they are almost universes unto themselves. So you go from the Cremaster cycle, the River Fundament, and Redoubt, which is the present film and exhibition. And each of those, I mean, I almost see you as a kind of like world maker. Each of those projects has the characters, the mythologies. They have like arcs and narratives that fold within them. And whether it's the films themselves or sculpture and works around, they all sort of like fold in and out of this universe. And I've heard you describe this sort of method of working, describe yourself almost like a system maker. And I wondered if you could just touch on that or explain a little bit how this sort of like method has started for you and how then it's continued over the past decades.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the narrative aspect of the system is something that's evolved over the years, and to the extent that it's more of a fleshed out story at this point, I think it wasn't always the case. Although I think I always identified with it as a narrative, and so I'm speaking of works like the Jim Otto works from the early 90s. I think those were certainly narrative, and moving image works in part, but much more they're basic in their structure. And I think my interest in video really grew out of really a need to document action and performance. And so I would say that my roots are more in that than they are in filmmaking, in performance, in performance-based video. Right, more or less right from the start, as I was making performed situations, I was also capturing them on video. And sometimes there was no audience at all, and really just the camera. So the evolution of these more cinematic works still came out of this kind of more basic process of documenting a real-time action. I think it's important to say that because a lot of the collaborators that you spoke of, I've been working with during that entire transition from those more documentary-based videos to the cinematic works, and so we grew together as a team, and we gained skills along the way as we needed them, and we also met other collaborators who were more specialized. But in terms of your question, I think I'm speaking about the films, and I think the film is the center of the system, and it has been for quite a long time. And I do tend to start with the narrative, and in this case, the film, and work out from that with the sculptural works and then the drawings. Drawing plays a pretty crucial role in it, in the sense that it's the tool that I use the most in the beginning, while mapping out the structure of the piece, and eventually the narrative and the characters, and then writing takes over and a script is developed. And the film is produced, and I tend to then move on to object making, and then I return to drawing again at the end of the process. I tend to think of it as the most kind of distilled part of the process, and one that's quite important in terms of both filling out the form, but also in moving on to a new one.
It's really interesting to hear you at the outset there talk about the system as coming from like a possibly conceptual performance area or background, and that defining structure, as opposed to, or maybe it works alongside, like the process of filmmaking, where you have to know the world because you're shooting the film. So you have to know all the characters, you have to know the narrative. You've got to have storyboarded so you know what scenes you're setting up. So in a way that the necessity of setting up a whole universe and a whole worldview might come from the natural filmmaking process. But it also seems that it really does sit earlier for you with the performance-based work there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think performance finds its way into the work in many ways, but I think that it's the thing that I know better than pure filmmaking, and so I think often looking for ways of activating the set or the scene that we're working on when making a film with a performance-based problem. Either approaching a scene as a real-time action and then filming it, and then of course editing it later into more of a cinema scene. But sometimes I'll choose to approach a scene that way. And you had mentioned River of Fundament. I think that was probably a more extreme example of that, where entire sections of that project were performed live in front of an audience and then edited into the film. So that was a conscious attempt to try to merge those two ways of thinking and making into one project. I think in the case of Redoubt, the way in which the choreography was affected by the weather and the conditions in the snow and the topography of the landscape we were working in, that it became like a drawing restraint problem in a way, and one that I think it interested me in the way that it was colliding with the filmmaking process. That the conditions of the situation were overtaking the narrative in certain instances, and it really changed the role that dance plays in the piece during that production.
Yeah, this contingent element seems to have a strong role there. And we'll definitely come to that in dance and choreography. I wanted to lead off on your role then as artist, director, but also performer. So with the cinematic films, you have roles in them. So how is it working for you when you shift into a more cinematic role and you're then performing both as the director, but also within the narrative, so to speak, of the film?
Well, I mean, I think we could talk about Redoubt. I think, I tend to choose roles that, or I tend to decide to put myself into the film when I can see that there's either a task that I know I either want to carry out or I feel like I could best carry out. And in the case of Redoubt, the aspect of drawing was sort of one of the kind of core concepts of the work, and the way in which this character called the Engraver would document what was happening in the rest of the story on to copper plates. That's definitely an experience that I wanted to have myself. And I also wanted to be able to generate a body of work out of this narrative in that way. And I think it's a clear example, but I think it's not so different from the roles that I've played in other pieces. That they tend to be task-based, like many of the roles in the films are in general.
In Redoubt, it's a part of, I think it's almost like a complexity of perspectives or optics, whereby within the film there's a constant shifting of perspective, whether it's the camera embodying a certain character or taking a third person view. But then within the larger project, you have the fact that the engraver is documenting, is witnessing the goings on of this world. But then those plates are sort of extracted, presented within the exhibition created by you, Matthew Barney, artist. So there's like a layer, a meta layer there around the work. But then they have their own sort of parallel extrapolations in a way. So the engravings in the exhibition then are set into series that undergo different electroplating treatments. But of course, the engraver in the trailer, along with the electroplater, is experimenting with that same process. So it seems like in Redoubt, this the optics sort of like fold within the film, but then also expand out of the film. And that's a really sort of neat conundrum in a way to hold in the project. With Redoubt, the turn of phrase that has continually come up, and it's one that I really liked when I first heard you use it. It was a portrait of place, and you spoke about the film, which takes place in the Sawtooth Mountains, as well as all of the sculptures, engravings, drawings, the whole project as this attempt to create a multifaceted portrait of this area and its history. And I wondered if you could speak about, that approach, and, is it documentary? Is it more mythological? How much abstraction is there to the history?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I would start by saying that Redoubt is probably more naturalistic than most of the work that I've made before. So I think there's a more objective approach to this film than there has been with others. And so it is true that I think I approached this with some ideas about documentary. I certainly wouldn't call it documentary in form, but I mean, I think I was thinking in those terms, both in the shape that the production would take because of the difficulty of working in that condition, but also in, as you're saying, in a way that that the place has an intrinsic complexity to it and a kind of a contradiction, both politically and geologically, and it also has this history with the reintroduction of wolves that I was really interested in exploring in a work. I mean, I think that with past work, I've often, in a certain way, made other portraits of places. But I think the complexity came from combining aspects of the place with aspects of my own narrative. And this is a different approach. I think this piece is more objective, although in my mind it kind of carries the same level of complexity. I think it might be possible that I was interested in doing this and able to do it with this location is because it was so familiar to me. It's an area not far from where I grew up, and one that I know pretty well. So it's certainly different than going to Budapest and making a piece for me. It's a very different proposal, and the narrative around the reintroduction of wolves in that landscape, goes back to my early life in Idaho, my teenage years, when the proposal was made in the mid '80s, and for the next 10 years, this kind of argument took place about whether the wolves would be brought to the area. On one side of the argument, I probably don't even need to say this. I think the same argument is being played out in many countries in the world, in Spain and Scandinavia, and other states other than Idaho. It's always the same argument, really, between the kind of conservation voice and the sort of landowner, rancher, hunter voice. And I think what captured my attention and my imagination as a young person was just how angry people got about it, and how fiercely contested the argument was. And as a young person, I kind of wondered why it was touching on such a nerve. And I think, over time, I continued to think about it, and I continued to think about it as a potentially interesting and loaded topic for work, in the sense that, wolves occupy a kind of mythological place in people's imagination. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that the argument is certainly not really about what a wolf is. It's sort of about what a wolf represents. And so this narrative did play out in this part of the state, in the Sawtooth Mountain Range. And it's also an area that is a designated wilderness, and the largest of that kind of designation south of Alaska. So it's quite a large piece of land. And I think it's something that, having grown up around there, it had the landscape itself had a kind of mythological resonance. So there are a number of reasons why this place and this particular story has been on my mind for all these years.
Mm. And I think people are generally kind of amazed to hear that it's like seed planted very early on. I was just reminded that we do have some images from the exhibition, so I hope that many of you have seen it already. But if you haven't, or if you'd like to see it again, please come and do so. So we'll just let those run in the background so people get a sense of what we're talking about between sculptures, engravings, and the film. But just holding on that place. And, I was wondering, as you're describing, perhaps in more detail than I've heard you describe before, the memories you have as a youth in a place, turning those over a number of decades, but then returning to it, and you return to it with, a critical lens. You return to it with, as a researcher, as an artist, and then you have to take the step of representing that, or abstracting it, or representing some objective aspects about it. And I wondered, returning to the area, to all the stories, did much change for you when you went back in and you delved back into the area and the land and the people, the places and things? Was there something different that occurred to you when you engaged as an artist?
It's something I enjoy very much, working in a place and getting to know a place intimately by bringing my work into it. And yeah, I think that there's a kind of a mystery to the sawtooths in the way that they're very much like a wall, and they feel somewhat impenetrable. But I think it's one thing to kind of take a hike and sort of pass through an area like that. I think it's another thing to kind of bring your whole language into that place. And I think the very act of doing that, you know, changes that landscape forever for me. So yes, it's changed a lot.
And with the film, with the overall body of work, there are these factual elements, of course, but then layered on top and sort of between and throughout are various mythologies, you know, from the American West to Ovid and classical mythology, to certain ideas of, you know, cosmology, also to, you know, non-Eurocentric mythologies. And I wondered if you could say a bit about this process of building up all these different layers that we watch, and then, you know, we're asked eventually to start unpicking them and draw these connections between things. So that process of sort of building everything up and putting it together.
The wolf narrative carries with it a certain drama and even, I would say, even a kind of a genre with it. And that certainly kind of crosses over into the Western, I would say. And that I think that landscape there has, I mean, it has that kind of distinctiveness that the Tetons have in Wyoming. It has, you know, some of those landscapes in the Southwest that are, that show up in the backgrounds of many Westerns. You know, I think it has that kind of an iconic feeling to it. And so I think that it also has the trauma that exists in that landscape from the displacement of indigenous people and the, you know, all of the reservations that continue to function out there. It's very present in that landscape. So that's all to say that I think the Western exists in the situation already, and I think it's something that I didn't really need to push any further. I was interested in tackling the subject of land management and wildlife management, and the way that the wolf debate kind of carried out to the present day with the success of the breeding pairs of wolves. You know, there are now thousands of wolves in the area. Hunting season has been opened. More recently, a kind of an unlimited hunting season, and even more recently, a proposal to hire contractors to just come in by helicopter and kill off a certain number of wolves. So wow. It's you know, these are a lot of all of these choices are complicated, and so I wanted, while I didn't want to make a political artwork, I did want to get into some of those specificities, at least in my thinking. Mm-hmm. And I felt like the best way into this was through Diana, weirdly. That Diana, in a sense, is an aspect of a land management, or like a wildlife management, in terms of what she represents. And I felt like it would be a way of telling the story without getting bogged down into a kind of binary way of thinking. I mean, Diana for me kind of continues to be multivalent and complicated as a character, and I like that about her.
Mm-hmm. And I think you've often, well, you've spoken of, but one of the main features or artistic decisions in Redoubt is to not have any spoken language.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the characters, Diana and her entourage, their language is very much the language of dance and movement. And because Diana is a hunter and the story is about hunts, I found it really fascinating to hear you talk about how that movement is in relation to the landscape and in relation to the activity. It's almost task-based, as you mentioned before, and using that as a starting point to figure out then how the different characters through the film communicate to each other. Is that quite right in terms of the role of choreography in Redoubt?
Well, I mean, I think it ended up being quite extended as an idea. That yes, there are characters in the piece who are using an explicit dance language, but there's also a rifle that's being fired and a trajectory, a projectile that's moving through the landscape, and arcing as it loses energy. And there's a needle being dragged through the surface of the copper. And these were all sort of aspects of movement that I think started to inform how choreography would be defined within the piece, and that every aspect of movement in the piece could belong to that idea of choreography.
I also want to move to the sculptural work and engraving work in the exhibition, because I think it's really interesting. I hope you see in the photos here that there's a real balance between the two, and in particular in the Hayward, where the film is presented in a more open configuration. Let's start with the tree, the large-scale sculptures. So on the one hand, they're based on trees from the area, lodgepole pines. They're trees that have been burnt out from forest fires, so there's also that aspect, forest fire aspect. But they undergo such an amazing transformation on their way to becoming sculptures. It's alchemical in some ways. Transformation is a big theme that runs through the whole project. But I wonder if you could take us through those large-scale sculptures in terms of the different languages they address. Like, you've got the tree on the one hand, which kind of accounts for the scale. But then you have this tactical language on the other hand, which is some parts weaponized. There are some recognizable artillery or rifle components there, but then there's also a sort of tactical language of that landscape. So I wonder if you could speak about how those sort of came to be aesthetically.
Mm-hmm. We filmed in an area where there are forest fires nearly every year, and so I spent a lot of time around these burned trees while we were working, and it felt like a compelling way to bring that sense of place into the sculptural language, to work with these trees. But I think it felt a little bit um, questionable whether that feeling of kind of trauma or a kind of existential weight that the trees have when they're standing in the landscape after they've been burned, and how that quality could possibly be transformed because it's so reduced already. And so I started thinking of ways of layering trauma upon trauma in a certain way, like taking them into the foundry environment. And like the first piece that we made was Elk Creek Burn. And that is the piece in the exhibition where the burned tree remains. And the metal was poured through the tree, through channels that we opened up. And the metal was contained by packing sand, resin bonded sand around the tree. So with the molten metal inside the tree is smoldering and burning again. And we're moving as quickly as we can to remove the sand and to extinguish the fire. So there's a kind of an eventness to that, that way of working that appeals to me, but it also felt like there was no way around, like it wasn't sufficient to cast these trees and try to capture that, the existential weight that they have in the landscape. I think something else had to happen. And so that was the first experiment. And from there, we moved on to using the computer in a number of ways by scanning the outside of a tree. Like a Basin Creek Burn is a good example of this, where the topography of the outside of the tree was scanned, and that data was used to drive a computer-driven mill that carved the inside of the tree with that same form. So we made a miniature of itself inside the tree as a vacancy. And then we opened up holes from this hollow core to the outside of the tree. And then on the outside of the tree, we carved a spiral around the outside of the tree. And sand was used again around the outside, and metal was poured through that vacancy. And through those channels, metal came to the outside of the tree and cast that spiral. So all of that happened in one process, which is quite unusual in the foundry arts, where typically all the different parts are made separately and then welded together. This was made with one in one pour, not the entire length of the tree, but in sections. But effectively, the inside of the tree and the outside of the tree were cast at the same time. And the tactical bases of those two sculptures are very similar. I wanted to try to bring the language of the tactical apparatus, whether it's the gun or the mountaineering equipment, the firefighting equipment, all of this equipment that's used in that landscape to harness it tends to have a very specific, quite overdetermined aesthetic. And in the questions that Redoubt asks about wildlife management and land management, I think there are some answers in the relationship between the tactical base and the sort of naturalism in the form of the tree. And I wanted for that relationship to be nearly violent in its opposition.
Mm. And you really are, like when you see it, there's almost, when you see the large sculptures in person, there's almost a sleight of hand that goes on, because the metal's been worked so fine, it's almost like it looks effortless. But when you can go into it and really understand that you are pushing the boundaries of the material, as you say, completely not standard foundry practice, but there are these layers that go into the making of the sculpture, which are computer driven. There's a lot that's done by hand. There's multi layers to the sort of prep process as the thing is, or before the thing is cast. And I wondered about that aspect of experimentation, of really getting to know the material, the metal, finding out what it can do, and then almost figuring out how could I make it perform even more or do even more. Because you look at these things and they're like that. Mm-hmm. Almost, it's kind of uncanny in a way. Mm-hmm. And you use both copper and brass, mm-hmm. and choose between, make decisions between different parts, being one or the other, or how the two meet. I wonder if you talk about the experimentation that goes into that, or the sort of, what I would call like the technical innovation that goes into it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it'd be interesting to talk about Slug. It's a small work in the exhibition near the entryway, which is made from copper and brass and lead. And that was made with a technique that we developed during the River of Fundament project. And it was made by taking, in this case, copper and brass and pouring them simultaneously into a vat of mud. It's a clay called bentonite that was mixed with water and put into a metal tank, and the molten metal was poured kind of free-handed into this open vat. And
sorry, I don't have Slug, but I'll call slide 21, which is Elk Creek Burn, mm-hmm. which has a little section of the mixing of metal there. Yeah,
that's right. But the bentonite, I think, does a couple of things. One, it gives the metal a chance to find its way into different vacancies in the slurry, before it hardens. It also gives the two metals an opportunity to mix in part and then also stay distinct, so that an alloy isn't created. I think if you pour those two metals together into an open mold, you end up with a pink metal, right. A combination of copper and brass. So I was interested in finding ways of marbleizing these two metals, and this was the solution that we came up with. And so I think, in terms of your question, I think it's true. I think when you start working with the material in that kind of rather primitive way, you learn a lot about what it can and can't do. And it's surprising how different metals are in their behavior. They have wildly different melting points. They also have wildly different kind of hardening properties in terms of how quickly they solidify, which is not necessarily in direct correlation to the melting point. It's just to do with their chemistry. So I think when you're asking the metal to do different things like this, all of these factors become really important. And yeah, I would say that process with slug is probably on the most primitive end of the range of processes that are in the exhibition. And on the other end, there's probably Cosmic Hunt in the entryway, which is which has the body of a wolf, which was scanned and then 3D printed as a one-to-one scale object, and then that scan was dipped into the ceramic shell, and the 3D print was burned out of the ceramic shell, and the metal was cast into that. So by approaching it this way, we didn't have to make a mold of the wolf's body, and therefore the detail in the hair could be so much more articulate than with traditional lost wax casting. So, I mean, certainly due to recent innovations in 3D printing and the foundry tools.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the two large-scale sculptures, Cosmic Hunt and then Slug, or one of the burns, in like quite a sort of clear conceptually what you're asking the material to do. And not so much with Cosmic Hunt, but the other ones that are sort of molten metal. Because when you see the process shots, you know, there's like forklifts pouring molten metal while everybody's wearing like heat suits. And it's you know, clearly still very much an industrial process that requires experimentation, requires a knowledge of how the material is going to behave, because you can't sort of tweak it on the fly as this material is like burning the tree up. Which makes it, you know, the final product sort of all the more remarkable. I wondered if you could touch on the process then as well about electroplating. And I've been fortunate enough to see, you know, in your studio there that you'd had set up, maybe you still have set up, all the different vats for and baths for electroplating. And really had to understand and spend many, many weeks playing, essentially experimenting, learning the process yourself and mastering it, but then also allowing a certain degree of artistic freedom. So, you know, in the show, what we'll see is a series of electroplates, like number of states, as you call them. So state 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And each one is different. And you've taken some artistic decisions there about chemical compositions or how the thing is behaving with the anode, the plate being the cathode and an anode in the bath. So tell us a bit about that as a kind of experimentation with, I guess, what's ultimately a traditional art form as well.
Yeah, I mean, my introduction to, I mean, it is used in printmaking, for example. It is used in different art making practices. My introduction to electroplating was more industrial. I brought a work to an industrial plater during River of Fundament, and it was unusual in its scale. The much larger object with much more complexity in its surface than what would typically be plated. You know, usually what's plated is a smooth object where there's not a lot of negative space. You know, like the electroplating process was invented for something like a bumper, you know, where you have a smooth object that wants a very thin, shiny coating of chrome on it, or whatever the metal is. And So I brought this object that had a lot of negative spaces, and it was much larger than their tanks. So we ended up building a tank in their loading dock and trying to plate it. And in order to plate something that large, they had to pump a lot more current into, they brought a tremendous amount of electricity into that tank. And it created all kinds of anomalies on the plated surface, where on the extremities. And we kept plating over and over and over again to try to get the negative spaces plated. And while that would happen, the extremities just kept building up metal. So I learned a lot about what happens if you do it wrong, basically. What happens if you push that technology to do something it's not really built to do. And so I got super excited by this, and then built a tank in my studio and started experimenting on a smaller scale. And that was one of the starting points for Redoubt, was, you know, having the ability to start playing around with that process and thinking about how it could work on a two-dimensional surface in a controlled way. And so, yeah, I mean, you already spoke a little bit about what electroplating is or how it works, but I mean, briefly, it's a tank. When you're plating copper, it's a tank of sulfuric acid. There's copper sulfate in solution. You have on one side of the tank a block of copper, and on the other side of the tank, you have the object that you want to plate. And you put electrical charge on the copper block and on the object you want to plate, opposite poles. The copper starts dissolving in the solution and then travels through the tank, attracted to the object you want to plate. And it starts growing on that object. And so the way that those works in the exhibition are made is that, like an etching plate, there's a ground, which is made of an asphalt-based substance. And then the drawing is carved through that ground and into the copper, exposing the copper. And that gives a conductive surface for that copper in the electroplating bath to bond to. So what was a negative in the engraving becomes a positive relief after the process of electroplating. Mm-hmm. So that's the basics of it, but it's true. There's a quite a broad range of techniques in the show that range from a straightforward plating, like I've described, to like throwing the chemistry in the bath off so that the metal is attracted to the corners of the plate rather than to the center of the plate. Mm-hmm. You know, using different solvents to disrupt the ground so that the copper would deteriorate the ground, or the acid would deteriorate the ground faster. And probably the most extreme effect is the sort of process of burning that's done by taking the charged anode and moving it closer to the cathode and burning the metal that way with the electricity. So some of the dark regions of the works in the exhibition were created that way.
And fascinating full circle to take the idea of burning in the forest fires onto the plates, and it happens in solution, of course, so it's underwater, right? Mm-hmm. Just taking a step back again, and the Redoubt project, and the fact that you worked for years and years on a particular project, what makes the project complete, or how do you know when the work is done for that body of work and it's then time to move on to the next research project?
I mean, with any given like work within the project, I think, I mean, I think I'm probably a little bit old-fashioned in terms of the way I think about resolving an artwork. I think, it's about, for me, about creating presence, and I think that that's what I'm looking for when I'm trying to finish a work. I think as far as when the system is finished, I think that the system remains active and useful as long as it's creating work. And at a certain point that starts tapering off, and not necessarily very predictable when that happens. I'm still making work at the moment from Redoubt, but I have a feeling I'm finished by the end of the year.
Wow, it's really powerful to hear you say, because it's like the system is generating everything. So you've kind of created the system, but then it's generative almost on its own. Fascinating. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. And last but not least, I want to thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much for not only a wonderful exhibition and a highly enjoyable installation process. I mean, everyone out there should know it was a very long one, given all the COVID protocols we needed to observe, but an enjoyable one. So I wanted to thank you very much for that, Matthew. And of course, thank you for being here with us this evening.
Pleasure. Yeah, thank you.